Hey Arthur, we're not the webinar doesn't start till 4:30, so you're welcome to hang out. But we're
No,
doing
that's cool.
cool.
I thought it was at 4 for some reason.
Yeah, hopefully that wasn't our fault. I'm gonna be doing like a tech check, so you're welcome to like leave and come back, or you like since you're like an insider, you can just hang out and listen to us do a tech check if you want.
No, I'll go do some other stuff and,
Okay.
and come
See you
back.
in a half an hour.
Bye.
All right, bye. We're just gonna give it another minute for folks to trickle in. Hi folks, if you're just joining, we're letting folks trickle in, and we'll be getting started very soon. Let's just give it another 30 seconds. They seem like we have a bunch of people coming in now. All right, I think we'll get started. Welcome everyone. We are so glad you're here. I'm Kara Roselle, the New England Soil Health Program Manager, and I'm here with my colleague Emrin Irby, New England Communications and Outreach Coordinator, who will be my co-host today. So I'm really looking forward to today's presentation. This is one of my favorite topics, and I'm excited to introduce you to our expert panel. But before we do that, we just have some context and some housekeeping items to cover. So please remain muted during the presentations. To mute, click or tap the microphone at the bottom of the Zoom screen. During the Q&A, we will have an opportunity to come off mute and ask a question live as time allows. If you would like to do that at the end of the presentations during the Q&A session, just use the raise hand feature on Zoom. Otherwise, you can place your comments in the chat and we will pose them to the presenters. Feel free to pop your questions in as they occur to you and we will keep track of them. And please just do be respectful and kind in your questions and comments. And as this session is being recorded, it will be available on AFT's YouTube at a later date. I'm going to hand it to Emrin.
Awesome. Thanks, Caro. Hi, everyone. So for those who don't know, AFT, American Farmland Trust, is a national nonprofit that's dedicated to saving the land through our three-tiered mission: protecting farmland, promoting sound farming practices, and keeping farmers on the land. We've been around since 1980 and have regional offices across the country, as well as our national office headquartered in DC. AFT works through both policy and programs in an effort to make agriculture resilient to the effects of climate change. And our team in New England is made up of roughly 18 folks who, work across our mission to support farmers of all scales in the region. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Alyssa White, who leads our climate and ag work, to tell you a little bit more.
Thanks, Emrin and Carol. So hi, everyone. My name is Alyssa White. I'm the Senior Manager for Climate and Agriculture in New England for the American Farmland Trust. Our climate and agriculture team works to address both the drivers of climate change and the impacts that climate change has on agriculture through educational resources, technical advising, financial support, and research in collaboration with farmers and other organizations across New England. Our approach to programming is driven by three primary strategies: creating peer networks, increasing access to technical assistance, and providing opportunities for financial assistance. Through our own individual work and our programs, we seek to make connections that contribute to problem solving on multiple scales And central to our approach to address climate change is a recognition that farmers are experts in the management of their farms and have been actively adapting to the extreme weather impacts and financial stress that is caused by climate change. We also recognize that farmers, sorry, I've got a visitor here. We also recognize that farmers have been working to be part of climate solutions for a long time. Much of our programming highlights farmers' expertise and facilitates opportunities for farmers to learn from each other about the issues that are most important to them and the innovative and emerging ideas that they find most promising. So I'm incredibly excited that our team is hosting this workshop on innovative cut and carry mulch systems that farmers have been talking about so much recently. So I encourage you to connect with us directly about our many programs across the region. Our website is listed on the page and has some links to some of our programs, but we also have a great newsletter that shares updates about upcoming grants, program updates, and workshops just like this. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you, Emran and Alyssa. So now I'm really pleased to introduce our presenters. I'm going to introduce all our presenters and then they're just going to go in this order. So Charlotte Giard-Laliberté, I'm sorry for slaughtering that, Charlotte, is a researcher at CETAB+, which is a research and knowledge transfer center focused on organic agriculture and affiliated with Canada's National Institute in Organic Agriculture. She conducts applied research projects on a wide variety of topics related to organic vegetable production in collaboration with many farmers in Quebec. She was particularly interested in finding ways to incorporate as much cover crop as possible into different organic vegetable systems. Jeremy Barker Plotkin and Dave Tepfer co-own and operate Simple Gifts Farm in Amherst, Mass, which grows about 10 acres of organic vegetable crops for sale primarily through an on-site farm store and CSA. And since 2019, they've been transitioning to their cropland to no-till production and are currently growing no-till on about 2/3 of their cropland. And on a personal note, I worked for Dave and Jeremy for about 6 years and consider them my farming mentors. Spencer Blackwell is a lifelong organic vegetable grower with 30 years of commercial experience on various farms throughout Vermont. And currently he owns and operates Elmer Farm in Middlebury, where he grows 7 acres of mixed vegetables for the fresh local market. So to give a quick overview of the session flow, we will start by hearing from Charlotte about her research work in Quebec, and then we will hear about Jeremy and Dave's systems and some results from a SARE farmer grant that they run. And then Spencer will share about his cut and carry systems as well. And each of our presenters has a different take on this approach. So I think there will be a lot for you to take away that might work in your system. So I think at this point, I am going to hand it over to you, Charlotte.
Great. Let me share my screen. Sorry about this. Yes. So can you guys see my presentation? Great. Yes, so I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm sorry in advance if I don't use the proper term or anything. I hope you can understand me well on with my big French accent still. So yeah, today I'll be talking about 2 of our applied research projects that we did in the past couple of years, touching on plant-based fertilization, cut and carry approaches. Just to let you know, if you're interested about the CETAB+, it's part of, as Carol said, a bigger organization, the INAB, as we call it here. And we have about a 50 hectare, we talk in hectare in Quebec, I'll be talking in hectares all along my presentation, sorry about that. We have a 50 hectare experimental farm located in Quebec. And we also have a big website with a bunch of documents, unfortunately, mostly in French, but if you're interested, you can look at that, and also our YouTube page. We do mainly agronomic counseling, applied research, and we have a big knowledge transfer platform too with courses online. So this really makes a nice dynamic strategy between the counseling sector and the applied research. So a lot of our research activities are really done on the farms that we work with. So why at the CETAB+ were we interested in looking at cut and carry approaches? because it's probably the same in the US, but in Quebec, as you know, like all the organic fertilizers commonly used are normally fresh and dried manures or compost. And this brings, this has indissociable inputs of phosphorus, potassium, and magnesium. Here in Quebec, our soils are often saturated in phosphorus, which brings environmental issues. We have limitations in phosphorus we can apply on most farms. So that's a big issue. And also most of our organic fertilizers in Quebec comes from conventional agriculture, conventional animal production, which is also an issue for farmers. They want to find alternatives. And also I've added this little graph on the bottom here, which is a paper that was published in 2021. They tried to model what would happen to the agro-ecosystem on worldwide if whole production was to transfer to organic production. So what they saw was it would probably lead to a gap of 50% production level, if you want, but 77% of that production gap would be due to nitrogen limitation. Access to proper organic fertilization. So as we see more and more organic farms popping up, as we also see maybe the need to reduce animal production with all the GHG issues, I think there's really like an importance to find alternative to commonly used organic fertilizers. This brings on many interesting research questions because, as you probably know, plant-based fertilizers are quite different in their chemical composition as compared to animal-based fertilizers. So main traditional animal-based fertilizers, I've put them here in terms of percent nitrogen, for example. They will be quite higher from the drier stuff, 5% for the pelleted chicken manure, for example, or 11% for blood meal. When you talk about the highest plant-based fertilizers like a pure leguminous crop, it'll be 1.5 only to 5% on a dry basis. And if you transfer it to fresh basis, it's only 0.3 to 2% nitrogen, so a little bit lower nitrogen content. Also, we expect to have higher carbon to nitrogen ratio in plant-based fertilizers as compared to animal-based. This will lead to, sorry, I have the faces of everyone in my slide, so it's a bit hard. This will lead to, as you can see on the graph on the right, lower mineralization rate. So the little triangles, black triangles here were alfalfa meal, and it was compared to a bunch of different organic fertilizers used in greenhouses, so blood meal, feather meal, and others. And we can see that basically alfalfa meal is usually the lowest, around 30% in that study, compared to 60% in mineral soil for most of the other fertilizers. So working with plant-based fertilizers is not the same as you cannot just substitute animal-based fertilizers by plant-based fertilizers and expect it to act exactly the same. Also, we were interested in looking at, well, we know that when you use cover crop in your rotations, as you can see on the left here, you have a bunch of beneficial effects. So because of the root system, amongst other things, and the exudates, you'll have more than the fertility effect, right? You'll have soil health benefits. You can break the disease cycles too. We were interested to know if when you use cut and carry approaches and just move the aerial biomass, can you also have more than the fertility effect to your system? Part of these answers I'll try to answer a bit during the presentation. So cut and carry approach, I think most people here already know what it is. It has a lot of advantages because if you have limited space for vegetable production on your farm, then you can import plant biomass instead of having cover crops in your rotation. You can also better control the quantity of the cover crops you apply and therefore better control the fertilization dosage. You can also better control the timing of application of your fertilizers. But there's also a couple of disadvantages. At least in Quebec, farmers are not always successful in their cover crops. So either cover crop failures or anything like that. It'll bring issues too in terms of having access to your fertilization source. You also need to have adapted equipment that is not often available on vegetable farms, at least in Quebec, forage equipment related. And I said you control the timing of application, but in a way you don't really control it, at least if you're using fresh biomass, because you need to optimize the timing of harvest. Here we say it'll be about when the plant is at 50% flowering, where you have like the lowest CN ratio with the highest biomass produced. So this also limits the timing in the summer when you can cut your plant, your leguminous crop and fertilize your plot with it. One of our project that we did on cut and carry approach, this one really was just a project looking at different plant-based material, cover crop material, and try to provide all the nitrogen needed for a cauliflower crop with either only pure green manure, either red clover, mixed prairie, fresh biomass of mixed prairie, or ensiled prairie mixed. So either bring 100% of the fertilization needed with green manure species, or with a control of pelleted chicken manure, which is really the common fertilizer used in Quebec right now on the bio-intensive farm, because it's really accessible and very cheap. I won't go into the details of all the treatments because I don't have that much time, but what you need to know is we looked at 150 kilo per hectare of nitrogen available, which is in Quebec the full dose requirement, either pure, or also we had a mixed fertilization with half animal based with the pelleted chicken manure or half green manure. So here, oops, that's in French. I'll go, the translation is here. So here I'm just presenting the results for some of the different green manures in terms of potential yields and nitrogen content for the first cut on the left. And I also calculated what I find interesting is the ratio of meters square that you would need of green manures to fertilize 100% of your cauliflower crop. So for 1 meter square of vegetable, for example, of your cauliflower crop, how much meter square would you need of your green manure? So what you can see with the prairie here, in terms of dry yield for the first cut in our system, it was much more stable in terms of yield. I think having mixed species, having mixed with mixed species, how do you say, grass and leguminous crops will make them more resilient to climate and everything, whereas it might decrease the fertilization potential, as you know. So in terms of red clover, we see big gaps, big differences in terms of dry yield for the first cut. And this will affect directly the ratio of green manure you need in terms of surface cultivated for the same, for the vegetable cultivated. So you can see example in 2020 versus 2021. If you wanted to bring 75 kilo of nitrogen per hectare with just prairie, you would have needed 2 times the surface in prairie than the surface in vegetable. And because the yield was better in the second year, you only needed a 1-to-1 ratio with the prairie. And you can see in the red clover here, it's 2 times the surface in red clover versus 6 times in 2021. So really the dry yield will affect the ratio, and it's really important to calculate it, like just applying a specific surface of green manure on your vegetable crop. You don't know how much nitrogen you're adding, and you have a lot of variability in the nitrogen fertilization you're doing with that. So here I'm presenting the yields in cauliflowers that we had marketable. Sorry, not the yield, the unitary weight in marketable cauliflower that we had. The average for the 2 years of the project. So we have the control unfertilized at the left, the lower dosage of nitrogen in the middle, and here it's all the full dosage of nitrogen in the last quadrant. And we have the plant-based fertilizers that are the 3 here, the animal-based that is the orange here, and the mixed fertilizers that are here. And what we can see just rapidly here is that we didn't observe a decrease in the unitary weight of marketable cauliflowers with using even the 100 plant-based fertilizers or the mixed fertilizers in terms of statistical differences. Although we see that the red clover, which is the lighter green here, either mixed or 100 pure, mixed here or pure here, had the best unitary weight in terms of marketable cauliflower. We also did some incubations of all the green manures in controlled conditions to look at release of mineral nitrogen, so nitrates. And so we see in the terms of number of days of the incubation here and the percent release of mineral N from the total applied N. I don't know if that's clear, but so the mineral N released over the total N that was applied. Sorry. What we can see with no surprise is that the pelleted chicken manure was the one that released the fastest and the most of its mineral N. But what's interesting to see is that hairy vetch here is following quite closely the pelleted chicken manure. And a little bit lower, we see all the different more perennial species, either of leguminous pure, like alfalfa, red clover, or mixed prairie mixed or ensiled prairie mixed. So our take on that was it would be very interesting to look at the potential to include annual leguminous crops in fertilization strategies because they will have lower CN ratio. As you can see, hairy vetch has only a 14 of CN ratio compared to the red clover that's at 23. And they will therefore release their nitrogen more quickly than the perennial leguminous crops. They also tend to have higher nitrogen content. I don't show it here, but that's also a fact. In terms of soil health too, I see that I'm already behind time. I'll try to, I speak slower in English than in French, that's the thing. So here I show results on aggregate stability. Whoops, that's too bad. On aggregate stability in water. So the aggregate of the soil that had 1 to 2 diameters, we add them in water in a successive movement like that, and we measure the proportion of these aggregates that are still stable after that movement in water. And what we can see here, it's the animal in orange till, the control in purple here, and all the other ones are different variations of fertilization, of plant-based fertilization, either mixed or 100% plant-based. We can see that in general, plant-based fertilization increased the aggregate stability compared to the animal fertilization, but that mixed strategies, right? A mix of animal-based and plant-based fertilization had the best results in terms of aggregate stability. And what's also interesting is that in that result is that samples were taken at when the cauliflower was at 10 to 12 leaf stage. So when, you know, it's a very important agronomic stage, and it's also a couple weeks already after fertilization event. So the beneficial effect of the fertilization is lasting throughout the season. Oops, this is bad. We also measured a couple other soil health parameters. So microbial respiration here in terms of CO2 levels, labile nitrogen, active carbon, and a global soil health score that is provided by our soil lab here in Quebec. Also same sampling dates here. And we've only did it for 3 treatments. So either the purely fertilized with the animal-based fertilizer, 100% fertilized with the prairie mixed, or the unfertilized control. And what we can see from these results is that for all the presented parameters, the treatments that were fertilized with the prairie mix did better on all scores, followed by the animal, the plots fertilized with the animal treatments, animal fertilizers. And lastly, unsurprisingly, was the unfertilized control. So interesting to see that the plant-based fertilizer, seemed to have a beneficial effect on, amongst others, microbial respiration. Just a quick fact also on the phosphorus and potassium level in the soil. So we want, as I said in the beginning, to use plant-based fertilizers to reduce our phosphorus levels in our soils, amongst other things. So here I present the phosphorus levels post-harvest after the 1 year of study in terms of kilograms per hectare. In the first box, it's the unfertilized plot, half fertilization treatments, and the 100% fertilization treatment here. In the orange, we see the animal-based fertilizers, and all the other ones are the plant-based. And we can see, unsurprisingly, that the animal-based increased significantly the levels of phosphorus even post-harvest. So we had to apply more phosphorus than what was actually taken by the plant. Whereas the plant-based fertilizers, here it's the 100% fertilized with plant-based fertilizers, actually decreased the levels that were observed at the beginning of the experiment, which is the red line here, dotted red line. And also a question that we had is the potassium, because we know that leguminous crops are actually high in potassium in terms of percent in foliar percent, foliar sampling, sorry. But is it actually mineralizing and this available for the plant? And what we could see here still, the red line is the amount at the beginning of the experiment, and orange is the animal-based, green is the control. We can see that in general, especially in blue is the red clover, which is the pure leguminous treatment, quite significantly increased the potassium level in the soil. That's, although a tricky result, because it was post-harvest, maybe applying 100% nitrogen requirements with leguminous crop will actually lead to over-fertilizing with potassium. So we need to investigate that a little bit more. I think from our results, we found that cut and carry approaches were quite interesting, but we definitely need in Quebec at least to develop tools to use to make that method more available and efficient in terms of times and economics on farms, and also maybe really look at varieties adapted to that strategies in terms of green manure varieties. And we have a big project coming on in greenhouse fertilization using plant-based fertilizers again. I can talk a bit more on that if you have any questions. I'll leave a couple minutes for the second project. So we had a second project on no-till strategies using organic mulches in vegetable organic production. It really was, sorry, this is all, I'll just put it all here, okay. It really was a first project for us in terms of no-till. So we mainly wanted to get familiarized with the technique and look at the mulching effect in a no-till system compared with a control that had no mulch and just had a sort of conventional organic strategy with groundwork and everything. Mulches that we looked at were leaf mulch, mulch with branches like wood branch, and an mulch with ensiled prairie mixed or a switchgrass straw mulch. We did this project on 3 years to really have the no-till effect on the lettuce, garlic, and broccoli crop. We also had split plot of side dress fertilization, also provided with pelleted chicken manure. And just quick facts, like this project was on a sandy loam, all beds were on raised beds, and we applied all the mulches in terms of height and not in terms of weight, because we really wanted to maximize weed control. And yes. So I'm just showing a few results related to the fertility of those treatments, but I can answer different questions if you have some afterwards. So here are the soil nitrate levels in the topsoil. at different dates in 1 year of the project. So this is the nitrate in terms of milligrams per kilo of dry soil, either at the beginning of the season or at the end of the season. And we can see here is the no side dressing and 100% side dress here on the right. And we can see that the ensiled prairie mixed mulch really increased the nitrate levels in the soil. So the nitrate is soluble, right? So with water, it'll move into the soil. And the levels were actually even higher than the control, even when you provided the 100% fertilization rate. This effect was disappeared at post-harvest. So we hope that it was the crop. In that year, it was broccoli crop. We hope that it was because of crop uptake, but it might also be because of leaching, which is a question that we want to answer eventually. And in terms of yield, what we saw basically, this is for the lettuce in the first year. I present the cumulative yield in terms of kilo per linear meter for the first harvest, second harvest, and third harvest. And we see that the ensiled prairie mix mulch increased sorry, how do you say that? Shorten the amount of days required between transplantation and harvest. So we harvested more quickly in the ensiled prairie mixed mulch here. But also when you look at the cumulative yield total at the end of the third harvest, ensiled prairie mixed mulch also had the highest yields in general, even compared to the control with the conventional organic treatment, if you want. I'm going quickly, but as I said, I can answer your questions afterwards. Just this last result is on the broccoli. So after third year, we observed quite similar effect. So in brown is the branch mulch, in orange is the leaf mulch, in green the ensiled prairie mix mulch, straw and the control in gray. And we saw, again, that in general, no matter the side dressing treatment, marketable yields in broccoli were higher in ensiled prairie mix. Mulch, this is not very surprising when you compare it to the other mulch, because we know it has a higher nitrogen content. But what is interesting is we even had better yields than the control treatment. Although, even though we brought a lot of nitrogen with the ensiled prairie mix mulch, the effect of side dressing was still significant, no matter the type of mulch that was used, which bring us the question of like synchronicity and timing of the nitrogen availability of nitrogen in the ensiled prairie mix mulch. Yeah, and just this I think is very interesting. It's not my result, it's a result from a French team that really are specialized in looking at dynamics of carbon and nitrogen cycle from residues in the field. And here it's the effect of either if the residue is left on surface or incorporated in the soil in green, the effect on the mineralization of carbon, or the effect on a level of soil mineral nitrogen. So what you can see here is that with no surprise, the incorporated residue will mineralize its carbon faster than the one that's left on the surface. But what's interesting is that the result is opposite in terms of mineral nitrogen. So the amount of mineral nitrogen in the soil will actually be higher for the residue that's left in surface than incorporated. And this is because the microorganisms don't have access to the carbon of the residue, so they won't immobilize it in their cells, right? So you have more mineral nitrogen in the soil, even though you have less carbon mineralized. So I think that's a great result when you try to look at cut and carry approaches in terms of fertilization potential. It also leads to leaching risks, but I think yeah, we want to look more into that in our future projects. So thank you. I hope you understood something with my English, and I'm available for questions.
That was so interesting. We do have a couple of questions in the chat, and so we do have a few minutes to ask a few direct questions before we go on to Dave and Jeremy. So Spencer wanted to know, and this is, I believe, about the nutrient portion. In the fertilization experiments, are the green manures chopped material being applied on top of bare ground?
Good question. Sorry. Yes. No, they were chopped, but they were incorporated to the soil. So that was the difference, sorry, between the two projects. So the cut and carry first project was actually fertilization incorporated to the soil. And transplantation occurred only 2 weeks after incorporation of the material.
And did you say how it was incorporated?
So we used a bunch of different tools because we couldn't find the proper ground working tool to incorporate that much biomass. And we ended up using I have to look at the translation. It's called machine à bêcher in French. I'll look at the translation.
Great. You could also just describe it to us if that's easier, but I'll go on to the next if you can't find it. Chuck wanted to know how long your prairie mix was ensiled.
It was actually residue from leftover from a dairy farm, so it was ensiled for a year in individual bales.
Great.
Yeah, and I think we could. So it did. So we had it both, right, in our cut and carry project and in our so in the first cut and carry with incorporation of the biomass project and in our mulch project. And what actually led to the result I presented in the end is that in the first project where we incorporated the ensiled mix, it was actually not doing that good. At least it did not as good as in terms of yields and unitary weight. I didn't go into these details, but didn't do as good as, for example, pure red clover or even the prairie mix. But it definitely seemed to do better in the mulch situation.
Got it. Philip was wondering what the control was in the second experiment on mulching.
Yeah, and it's a spader, the machine.
Oh, spader.
Yeah,
thank you.
So our control, we had compost applications and cover crops after each season, and we used a permanent raised beds tool. So it's a series of 3 tools that we use for permanent raised beds ground soil work. So it's a disc, cultivator, and I have to also look the name of machine in English, but basically we have three machines to prepare the beds before the season, and we use compost and cover crops in between the season for fertilization and improving soil health.
Got it. And I think we're going to squeeze in one more before we go on to Dave and Jeremy. Ian asked how weed seed viability is after ensiling, and does ensiling cause dead seed, basically?
Yeah, I didn't go into the weed pressure results, but we did see a good control. The problem with the ensiled prairie mix wasn't the seed bank from the prairie mix, the ensiled prairie mix. It was more that because it mineralizes so fast compared to other mulches, even with the quantity applied, it actually ended up leaving a part of bare ground at the end of the season. So that brought on a bit more pressure, a bit more weed pressure than the mulch with the higher CN ratios like leaf and branch and straw. But we didn't have issues of grass or leguminous or weeds from the ensiled mix. Yeah.
Got it. That's very helpful. So if anyone, if questions occur to anyone else, we should have a little time at the end for additional questions. Charlotte, thank you so much.
Great.
Great. All right, so we're going to go to Dave and Jeremy. Emmer, you're sharing, right? Yeah, perfect. All right, Jeremy, you are on mute. Oh,
Unmuted.
you
Yeah, so we're going to talk about our cut and carry mulch system. You can do the next slide. I think, Dave, you're starting out, right?
Yeah. Let me get rid of this so I can see what we got here. Okay, yeah, Simple Gifts Farm, just quick lay of the land. What we're doing here, we manage about 50 acres of land. About 20 of that, I don't know what to call it anymore. It's tillable land, but we're growing no-till, so it's potentially tillable. I don't know. And on that, we raise about 10 acres of annual organic mixed vegetables, whole variety stuff. We've been doing it, I guess, 17 years here now. We have a long-term lease on the farmland. Our main sales outlet is through our on-site farm store, and we run a CSA out of there, and then we do a little bit of wholesale. Livestock, we've used livestock for our fertility, for helping with our fertility for a long time, laying hens and beef cattle. Set the scene a little bit more. The soil we're on, most of it's a loamy sand soil, not a sandy loam, but a loamy sand over a couple 100 feet of some really premium quality gravel, excessively well drained. Much of it's sloped up to 5%, so surface soil erosion can be a big issue, which we'll talk about a little more. Been cropped since the early 1800s. It was a dairy farm as well as raising some vegetables and tobacco through most of the 20th century. It had been minimally farmed for about 20 years or so before we took over in 2006. The soil was severely compacted, almost no biological activity, basically dead. So we started with an aggressive cover crop, green manure cropping system. Sort of the centerpiece of that is 1/4 of the farm was fallowed from tillage every year and raised a crop of grass, perennial grasses and clovers, and we grazed cows and chickens on it. And applied a lot of compost, soil tested, applied micronutrients to balance a lot of that out. And then for the other 3 years, we raised fairly conventionally organic mixed vegetables. This showed pretty great results for a decade or more, but we were starting to wonder if we had gained all we could gain, and then a few other things happened, which we'll talk about soon. So I think next slide, and then Jeremy, I think we'll talk. Right now, you can talk a little more.
Yeah, so I think everybody's aware of climate change and what it's doing to agriculture, but just thought I'd review some of the projections for the Northeast. We're looking at warmer conditions and a higher average precipitation, but one of the big changes, and we're already seeing this happening, is that there'll be a lot more variation in precipitation with much more extreme weather events, and then also periods of drought. So I guess I think about adapting to climate as trying to figure out how to manage that that moisture variations is a big issue. Do the next slide. There's just some examples of what we've seen recently. Our average rainfall in Amherst is 46 inches. It's September 2018, we had 37 inches of rain. These are numbers that I had to going back and looking at them really kind of makes the problem very clear. And it was 2018 when we had that extreme rain that we started thinking more seriously about no-till. This picture is taken off of one of our tillage fields. This is after we had started doing no-till in July 2021, when we had basically a quarter of our annual rainfall in a month. This was like the final straw rain event that we had. But then last year we had extreme drought, and the number 7.5 inches doesn't really bring home how dry it felt on the farm. So yeah, next slide. So no-till can be a solution to that. The whole idea that the more you're doing for your soil health, you're sinking carbon into the soil, which is good for climate change. You're also the more carbon and the better your soil health, you kind of your soil acts as a sponge, and there's a, you know, a more ability to accept moisture, hold it, and release it when it's needed. Next slide. Yeah, so 2018, as I said, was when we started really trying to pursue no-till. Really, in a lot of ways, it's weed control is the main main thing that we worried about with no-till. You know, in theory, you've got, if you're disturbing the soil less, you have fewer weeds. But our whole cropping system is built around mechanical cultivation and controlling weeds by, continuously going through with cultivation equipment and disturbing the soil. So when you go no-till, you're really removing that tool. So really, we're reinventing our whole cropping system. So it's not a small deal, and it took us a while to really decide to do it. We do the next slide. On to you, Dave.
Yeah. So, looking at no-till farm, organic vegetable farming for a while, we kind of quickly figured out there's there's a lot of people doing really good, interesting stuff on 1 to 2 acre, mostly hand scale, and then there's the big iron equipment for managing some stuff on a huge scale. But for us, 10, 12 acres of annual vegetables, we weren't finding a lot to do. So what we set on doing is 2 separate systems for 2 kinds of crops. The first one is what we call our intensive system, which is basically applying a thick layer of low quality leaf compost, weed control by tarping with silage tarps between plantings, seeding or transplanting quick maturing crops, mostly greens and short-term brassicas and stuff like that. At times, or at twice the density that we used to plant, twice the planting density, and so that leaves no space for mechanical cultivation. And then also getting 2 successions per bed. So that allowed us to raise, for the same amount of crop in 1/4 the land area, which freed up some land for cutting mulch. That's not the system we're going to talk about today. The one we're going to talk about is what we call our extensive system, which is a transferred mulch or a cut and carry system. Is sort of copied after work done by a German agronomist that he's got a lot of videos out, John Heinrich Kropp. And we started this in a big way in 2021 with the equipment we purchased with grant money from the state of Massachusetts Department of Agriculture. The general idea, we'll go into a lot of details next, but you start with pre-made beds, generally with a fall cover crop of some kind, haul in mulch with a manure spreader, and haul in mulch spread with manure spreader, no-till plant into that thick mulch, and if done correctly, no more weed control needed for the rest of the season. Sort of interesting compared to the previous talk, how we came at this, first motivated by soil erosion and drying out in dry years, and by weed control, and we're trying to figure out the soil fertility end of it as we go. We'll go to the next slide. I think is that this is the first thing we did a number of years ago. We put extended spikes on our water wheel transplanter, which is what we plant most, all of our transplants go in with this. We've modified it more. We now have 5 wheels across, 5 wheels, so it's 9-inch spacing and 6 inches between the plants. So, that maximum density we'd use for Salanova or onions, and then less density for other things. We used this for a few years prior to launching into it, and it worked out well. Let's see. I
So
think the
those
next
spikes
slide.
allow us to kind of transplant,
Oh,
punch through the mulch and transplant.
yeah, that punches through the mulch to transplant. The next thing, yeah, we can go to the next slide now. We'll get into some of the difficulties with it, but it does work, punching a hole with that and transplanting, the plug, the transplant into there, but we wanted a little bit better holes. So we sort of see this. This is a Coulter, an attachment with Coulters, and also you can put on very small little shanks to loosen up the ground in front of where the water wheel is going to go. Which we'll talk about this. It works really well in if you're using leaf mulch or composted leaves for your mulch. It doesn't work very well in the longer fiber greenchop stuff. So next slide, I think. Yeah, here's a picture of the transplanter. I guess now's a good time. We'll talk about the difficulties with transplanting in a minute. So we can go on to the next one. Next slide. Yeah, this. Back one. Sorry, that one right there. Yeah, this is one of the things, new pieces of equipment we got. This made by these clever Italians, Crusoe company. They're the flail mower with a hammer flails, and it fills that hopper on the back. And then it tips back over center to dump into a manure spreader, and we'll spread that on the crops where we're on the beds where we're going to transplant it to. This allows us to drive on our permanent beds and harvest mulch off some of them, with never driving what's going to be the future planting space. So next slide. Yeah. So on the left there, that's the manure spreader. We spread it on the order of at least 3 to 4 inches thick. We're finding out that that's not thick enough. We'll go into that a little bit more. Mostly we do it with greenchop. We do some with composted leaves that we'll show in a minute. Here you can kind of see the transplanting into this greenchop mulch. It does work. It's much slower. We find there's a little, the person riding on back needs a little more training and a little more practice. They have to clear a little bit of mulch out of the bottom of the hole. Then the soil hasn't been disturbed. It's a little, compared to tilled soil, it's a little harder. So it takes an extra split second to really squeeze that dirt around the transplant plug that you just put in there. And we've got some ideas about how to make this better. And you can see there on the water wheel, there's all 5 water wheels are there, and only the center one has spikes on it because these cucurbits, we were just planting a single row. Next slide. Oops, I thought there was, I don't have the thing on the side. Isn't there? These are out of our, okay. Yeah, go on to the next one. I guess, Jeremy, this is where you take over.
Okay, I can. Yeah, this was, the first year that we did it, as Dave said, we did have a big learning curve. He talked about the issues of transplanting into the mulch, which, for something like the cucumbers that we showed in that last slide, that's not such a big deal because there's not that many plants going in per acre. But something like onions or Salanova, where we're doing it a 5 row, then it does take quite a bit more time to transplant. And those Coulters actually work pretty well through the leaf mulch, so that, which is what we did the onions into. And the Salanova was actually going into compost. So in some ways that, maybe is resolved somewhat. It would still be good to get that streamlined better. Another issue that we had was nitrogen tie up. We think, when you're mowing a big rye cover crop or a big any cover crop, but rye in particular, that it sucked a lot of the nitrogen out of the soil. So even if you're applying a lot of nitrogen in the form of the mulch, it's not there available for the crop right when you put the crop in. And we definitely saw some issues with establishment, especially the first year. We've tried to work around that more. And then the whole issue of when is the cover crop available to produce mulch is a real issue. You know, in the spring when we want to be planting, stuff, it's early for the cover crops to produce a lot of biomass. So do the next slide.
Oh yeah, this is the one I was going to go over briefly. You know, we're incorporating this into a whole, you know, farm system where we've got, you know, multiple successions of different crops. So we have a, you know, as big of a harvest window in the season as we can. So here in Western Massachusetts, we're planting, you know, all the onions, brassicas, chard, fennel in April. And that we would be planting into winter-killed oats and peas and mulch with leaves collected the previous fall. And we get a lot of those brought in by landscapers, and you know, that works out pretty well. We've run them through the manure spreader once to break them up some. And that's where those Coulters and the tiny little shank behind the Coulters works really well. But we have a somewhat limited supply of that sort of product. By about May 15th, we're transplanting the first round of all those you know, fruiting crops. That if we have enough, we'll plant into winter killed oats and peas as much as we can, but some of that might have to go into ground that had rye on it the previous fall, and for that we would want to tarp it about 3 weeks before that. So the last days of April we would tarp, pull the tarp off and mulch, and we can get some amount of green chopped mulch, but kind of mow all of our pasture and any, you know, a lot of rye that's just starting to go. This is where we'll have to mow a lot of ground to generate enough mulch to cover this. Stuff that goes in a little bit later, around the 1st of June, that's you know, if it's rye, it's too early to mow kill it, so we'll have tarp that about at least 2 weeks before, mow it and then tarp it, and around May 15th, so that by June 1st it's ready to plant. Again, mulch with all the winter grains or pasture grass, and then by stuff that goes in mid-June, there we can mow kill the rye. That's where Jeremy said, you know, we'll have a little more about this coming up, but that stuff's got so much carbon that, you know, there's a lot of total nitrogen there, but there's such a high CN ratio, a lot of the nitrogen seems to be tied up at that point. So incorporating this into a whole, you know, mixed vegetable farm, this is sort of a summary of the kind of strategies we have as we move through the season. Okay, I think next slide. Yeah, Jeremy.
Yeah, okay, yeah, we're running behind, but this is just a couple pictures showing kind of that we had pretty good weed control. The onion picture there, we actually did cultivate in the wheel tracks there, and we did get some weeds coming up that ended up being like a little too weedy by the end of the season, but it was enough that we got a good crop of onions out of there, which is often what happened when we cultivated anyway. The slide on the other side, you can see we're putting weed mat out sometimes when we have weedy spots. So we had pretty good weed control everywhere except for that one aisle in that spot. We're gonna do the next slide. Here again, I think there is weed mat down on most of this, but you can see like the weed control is kind of working. You can do the next slide. So we had a SARE grant last year where we tried to measure how much we harvested and applied of the mulch, and then also we're measuring the nitrogen release in the soil to try and document that and figure out whether we were in fact seeing a nitrogen issue. We can do the next slide. These are some of our numbers for the different materials at different times. I think just that May 18th date, you can see there's a pretty good variation, but you can also see like the June 16th, there's a huge amount more biomass there. The May 23rd dates there were, and May 30th there was, I think that was actually second cut on some things, but actually, yeah, F4 May 23 to O2 June 15, those are kind of equivalent. That's what rye's doing in that period. That May 18th, we have a lot of our fruiting crops going in, and that was something like 6 to 8 or 6 to 9 times the acreage to produce the mulch that we needed to cover, to cover 1 acre of to mulch. We also measured the nitrogen. We could hit the next slide. The top one is the interesting one. This is the nitrogen release over time in 3 different cucumber plots that were planted at different dates. And you can see that there is, so 20 is about sufficient. So we do have like almost enough nitrogen, or we have enough nitrogen in the first 2. The yellow one, the latest one, we actually forgot to apply any. We're using feather meal. So you can really see that, and this is the one where the rye had gotten real big before we mowed it. You can see there is a nitrogen tie-up issue. So it'll be interesting next year. This project's a 3-year project. It'd be interesting to see if we get better results when we put fertilizer down. We'd probably mow and then apply fertilizer and then apply the mulch over the top of that. Hit the next slide. So just some of the things we're thinking about for the future. First is figuring out how to streamline that planting into mulch. We think that there might be better coulters that we could experiment with. We're also looking at trying to modify the manure spreader, similar to what Spencer's going to talk about, where we apply the mulch to either side and then plant and then kind of break it in by hand, which is some hand labor, but maybe less than the hand labor to put the transplant like that. And then we're going to keep working on documenting what we're producing and the nitrogen needs of the crop. Then another big thing to that we see as an area for development is storing mulch in the summer and fall for spring application, which would really help a lot with that bottleneck in May when we want to get a lot of fruiting crops in, but the grass hasn't started growing yet and the cover crops haven't. Next slide. These are just some resources. You can do the next slide. And then thanks to SARE for funding the project, the Climate Adaptation Fellowship. Also, I didn't put MDAR on here, the Massachusetts Department of Agriculture. And then Caro through the American Farmland Trust through Caro has helped out a lot with this project. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, David and Jeremy. We're gonna just go right to Spencer because we're running behind schedule, and we'll save any questions for you until the panel at the end. Okay, so Emmer, I think you were gonna share great on it.
Hello. I'm gonna whip right through the introductions. Our farm is very similar to Jeremy and David's. A little bit smaller, but mixed vegetables. Lots of them. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. You all can look at these slides later if you're really interested. This is an overview of the farm from the aerial there. Everything's in permanent beds, so attempting anyways to maintain those sections. Each one of those individual sections, the orange, green, purple, red, yellow, our 8 planting beds, which is a tractor's width, as you can see in the picture down towards the bottom. That is, yeah, next slide. And so that is really the first step in making this system work. So I'm growing very similar to Jeremy and David's thing, program there. And so this is where I start. So I make these beds with a I'll start, and ideally they last for many years, but I'll do an 8-bed section at once. And in between the 8-bed sections, there's drive lanes, harvest lanes, places, it's just permanent sod, grass, whatever happens to grow. But it can be driven on, any time of the year really, without messing up the growing area. So for access. And the other area, the planting area, we just be very careful about not ever driving in those planting areas, because once the shape is messed up, it doesn't work as well. The system doesn't work as well. So I make those beds by some sort of primary tillage to just really devastate everything. And then a whole bunch of smoothing. I use a spring tooth harrow, and I drive in circles in my 8 beds, around to get everything like as smooth and perfectly flat as possible. And then I take a subsoiler and I rip through there, which is just a 3-shank subsoiler that fits within the width of the track of the tires. And once that has gone through, that sets the bed. So it's kind of messy still. It pops up but it pops up the center, makes it kind of raised in the middle, and the wheel tracks are simultaneously pressing down. And then after that, I'll run, depending on like how much residue, have what various different, either a disc, another spring tooth, or just a bed former, or some combination of those things to make what you see there. And then ideally, I plant a cover crop in that. And that just gets all that destruction taken care of with a cover crop. So all the kind of imbalances that may happen from that, things can get settled down in a crop that is of less, like I'm not going to try to harvest it, so it doesn't have to be as uniform. It also shows off if there's spots that aren't working as well. The cover crop will show off the failed areas, and I can address them before I put more valuable cash crop in. Next slide, please. And so the cover crop is also central to the weed control, providing so many benefits of just having collecting, the solar energy, collecting nutrients, growing nitrogen, everything that's going to help set the stage for having a really successful cash crop. Next slide. And so in that, growing the cover crop, it's not an afterthought, it's a main thought. And so I'm actually mulching the cover crops to try to prevent the weeds that you can see in the center there come up in between, like in a winter rye crop in October, September, October. Those weeds will get established in there, and they will be, something that, even if they're not a problem the next year, there's something they're not planned for, and I don't know where they're going to be. So the following year, when I mow that cover crop to plant a cash crop into it, I can, if it's not full of weeds in between the rows, I can plant my cash crop between the rows of rye, and which allows for less disturbance to try to like beat back the rye. So anyways, a relatively light spreading of that is rotted hay silage, which is what I use primarily as my mulch material. The finer chopped that material is, the better it's going to spread out evenly. So you can put a really thin layer, really light, small amount over a broad area and have more weed protection. The other thing is that I like to think of is erosion in terms of micro erosion. And so in the center there, you see those little clumps of soil that are sitting up, and the ones that are starting to get dry, all that stuff is dead soil. That's the wind is gonna, even if it doesn't blow it into the hedgerow, it's gonna like knock it down into all the little pores that are in the soil, and it's gonna make that soil less permeable and less. So next slide. I think I say it on next slide here. Yes, softens the barrier between the atmosphere and the earth with that mulch, filling up those little holes and providing avenues for your soil life to go up and down, pulling stuff down in. Next slide, please. Thank you. Emulating the kind of the action of a worm bin. If anybody's kept worms, you feed the fresh material on the top, the worms kind of live in the middle, and then you got the good stuff that just accumulates underneath. And ideally, that's like that system doesn't really, you know, you're not disturbing those layers as you're growing your cash crops. You're just separating the surface of that mulch layer to put your crops in, and you have all that like super active biological area. Probably, hopefully not the worms that dense, but a lot going on right there where you're putting your plants in. Next slide, please. A lot of the characteristics of mulch, this is like Jeremy and David were talking about a lot, is like and also Charlotte, you said that like your best mulch was your best one in terms of like giving nutrients was the clover silage, and that is true, but it goes away quickly. So you need to either reapply it or you need to put rules of it on in order to have a last throughout your season. So one of the things I've found is if you put layers of different types on, so you put the really gooey stuff on the bottom and then you put some more carbonish stuff on top, that kind of worked well. Next slide, please. This is a little bit, so the mulch I'm getting is these piles of rotten silage. It's like, so my neighbors have a dairy farm. They have their silage is in bunkers, and their bunkers are covered with plastic and tires. I'm sure you've all seen the setup. And anywhere up on the surface of those, anywhere the plastic ripped and raccoons got into it, it tends to rot out. And so they don't want to feed that stuff to their cows because they keep really good cows, and it's not good for them to eat rotten mulch. So they are probably more generous than some farmers. Some farmers probably would feed that stuff, but they like to get rid of it. And they at one point just asked me if I wanted it, and so I've been getting it from them. At first, I was really concerned about that weed persistence that may be in it, and I found next to none. And I think it must be, like Charlotte said, the ensiling process kills the weeds. The issue with it though is I don't really get to choose what it is or when I get it. So I get stuff that can be like extremely rotten and really hard to handle, or I can get stuff that's like basically fresh, good silage that is awesome. And also sometimes I'll get the heifer feed, and sometimes I'll get the dairy feed. The dairy feed's got a much higher nitrogen content. The heifer feed's much more it's got much more lignin in it. They'll like mix straw and stuff in with the heifer feed. So it just acts differently. So I try to keep my piles separate, and organized, and if I know I'm going to want some really high nitrogen stuff, I'll try to save that for later. But you don't want to save that stuff too long because it gets really gross sitting out in your field for too long. It turns into snot in your transplanting help. It gets really irritated. Next slide, please. So this is one of the strategies I've used to get the gooey stuff on the bottom, the nice high nitrogen stuff on the bottom. And you all seeing the screen? My screen disappeared.
Oh, sorry, Emran. I think I asked you to test a link.
Sorry about that. Give me just one second.
Okay. Anyways,
we were just preparing the PDFs for y'all, so that we can share the PDFs for you. And I forgot that Emran is screen sharing, so Sorry about that.
Okay.
Emran, can you pull the slideshow back up?
Yeah, 1 second.
Yep. And we've gotten permission to share the PDFs in the background here. So we'll be dropping a link to these PDFs in the chat for you momentarily.
Okay, so I grow a very, for like a, corn, cabbage, heavy feeding crops, I'll grow a very dense stand of yellow blossom sweet clover. I found is the best. Red clover works as well. And mow that with a flail mower, really fine, go over it a couple times, just pulverize the hell out of it right down to the surface. And then that leave that in place. That provides that really gooey stuff. And then later on, I'll spread something that's a little more lignified over the top of it. And that seems to work as a weed barrier for the whole season. This is the system, that's the subsoiler used in a different application here, where I'm just going in really maybe like 6 inches deep there, making just a little slot. And this is assisting with the transplanting primarily. And it also, I think, gives the transplants a little bit of a boost to have that freshly disturbed soil. So I have done it where I'll lay out drip tape right on top of the freshly mowed cover crop and stick plants into the wet spots. And they just take a longer time to get going than if you do a little bit of disturbance. So anyways, I'll pop up those slots there, and then I'll run the rototiller, which I took all the tines off except for the ones that are right above the slots. And I'll just knock the clumps out. I'm not going below the surface of the soil. I'm just beating up the stuff that pops up from the subsoiler. Next slide, please. And this is laying the mulch out after transplanting. In a second, I'll show you the thing that lays those it out in the strips like that. But I put it on a lot. The mulches goes on a lot heavier for in this application as opposed to the cover crop. I go a little lighter with the cover crop. It takes a lot of time to spread it all, and it's also a very kind of high, like, I don't want to say I'm high skilled, but it takes a little bit of practice to get the thing to lay right. So I can't just like put anybody on it. So it's all my time. At this point, I don't have any great operators on the farm. But that's what the system looks like there. Next slide. And this is kind of this is what we get. April 1st, it looks like there's not so I grow that cover crop, that's the sweet clover, and I mix when I seed that in August, the prior year, August. I seed it with a very small amount of tillage radish, and the tillage radish really is dominant through that first season, and the yellow clover gets established underneath the tillage radish. And you can see it puts those nice holes in there for with the tillage radish roots. And then in April, I'm always kind of like, ooh, I don't know if that's going to be enough cover crop there, but that sweet clover grows like gangbusters. That was my little fox friend that kept following me around every time I mow the sweet clover. And then 2 months later, we've got corn. That's my daughter. It's just absolutely fabulous. You can see the shine on those, and then just the girth of those corn stalks, sweet corn. It's absolutely beautiful crop with nothing added really, except for the mulch. Next slide. This is a way I do things that aren't mid-season. So early season crops, or these in this pictures here, this is overwintered onions. I grow an oat wheat or an oat pea radish mix, and I'll seed that at the beginning of August as well. And if it's going to be for an overwintered crop, I'll let that grow until, well, it looks like October 12th. And then same thing, pulverize the heck out of it with a mower, flail mower, so it leaves all the material in place on top of those beds. And this is why those bed shape is so important. If you have divots in your bed because somebody drove down the center of them, the mower is not going to cut the cover crop at that perfect, like as right at the root, you know, right at that threshold between the root and the leaf, where it's the most vulnerable and easiest to kill. So yeah, mow the cover crop, cut some little, I used a different tool to cut the slots for this, but I cut a little bit of a slot so you can get your transplant in without busting your fingers up, and then apply the mulch. And so that's the onions getting planted in October, and then in the spring, you can, that's April 6th there. That's what they look like underneath the covers. We haven't weeded anything in there, and that's a fabulous onion crop with no weeding at all. Next. This is doing some similar thing with carrots. So this time, instead of a legume cover crop, I grew, so I did the bed prep, like I made the beds for the first time in the spring, and just as pretty much as, well, probably mid-May. Soil's warm and dry enough that easy to work. And then I planted a buckwheat cover crop, and then mow the buckwheat cover crop, and then tarp it to kill it. Because buckwheat, if you mow it, you're probably not going to kill all of it, because it bends over, and it's, I don't know, it comes back. And also there's probably some weeds in there because it was a fresh, it was pretty freshly disturbed. So I use the plastic, solarize those right over the top of the buckwheat. And then this is a little old corn planter that I use just as the Coulters and then I added, you can see my hand there, I added those little things just to push the slot a little wider, so I can then it makes a nice strip to run a hand seeder down, which is how I seed my carrots. And then we lay the mulch on top. And I can also lay the mulch on first, and then push push it aside with those little. This is from a flail mower, that the little thing that it's like dull blades from a flail mower that I had replaced. Next slide. And so like with a bigger seeded crop like the beans, I've never done it with peas, maybe peas would work too. Anything with a real vigorous big seed, you don't even need to, you can just seed and then spread the mulch right over the top. So this is oats and peas that were killed with a mower. This was spring planted oats and peas killed with a mower mid-summer, and then slots run through it, pushed bean seeder through, and then covered it all up with the mulch, and then the beans push right through. Work like a charm. Next slide, please. Leeks. Leeks is going to be one that we'll do. The oats and peas are winter killed. And then I spread the mulch thick across the entire bed, cut the little slots right through the mulch, and then transplanted the leeks. And then because the leeks are in the ground for so long and they're such a small plant, the mulch was not sufficient. I couldn't put enough mulch on to begin with and still get in there to transplant. So I came back through in June, did a little hand weeding, and then put a second layer of mulch on top. And that was enough to take us through for 2 months without touching the leeks again. And they're a super clean crop. It's also handy because we have this thing called the leek moth that is forcing us to have our leeks covered with a net for the entire time there until Labor Day or so. Next slide. I think we get to show you how, yes, here, this is how that mulch gets spread in the strips. So it's just a box spreader. I think you saw a picture of it earlier from on the tractor. It's just a plain old box spreader. It's got a double beater, which is kind of nice for agitating any clumps that are in the silage, and then those shields that just hang down underneath. And it's, you know, custom. I just kind of made it work for what I had. Yeah, I'm sure all you ingenious farmers could figure out how to do it on your own manure spreader, and it would look a little different, but pretty simple. Those shields can come out, so I can either do 1 row or 3 rows or 2 rows or no rows, in terms of what I'm blocking the mulch off from falling on. It has to be really, really nice, like pretty much feed grade silage, in order for it to flow through those narrow slots there for a 3-row application.
Let's do about 1 more minute, Spencer, and then we should save 5 minutes for questions.
Okie doke. Next slide. I think I'm basically done. Just some pictures. Again, there, that's what happens if you get clumps. It doesn't spread nice. Next bit slide. It is very easy to cultivate through if you do have weed issues. This is the Lilston running through the mulch. I also run sweeps underneath it, so it's like a goose foot sweep kind of thing, where you can basically run the sweep underneath the mulch right at the soil level. The mulch flows over the top of it, and you know, if you have weeds poking through, you can kill them without really disturbing that mulch effect. Next slide. That's the test there. What was it doing to my soil in terms of fertility? I don't know. Charlotte can probably tell me more if you knew it. It seems to be doing good things. Organic matter has gone up. I mean, this is over the course of 2 years, and it's a ton of, I mean, I put 76 tons per acre. That's an enormous amount, more than I normally do, but that was an area that just happened to get that. I was like, all right, I'm gonna test this and see what it did. And that's what it did in terms of, this is, yeah, pretty much side by side, no other real significant changes between the 2 beds other than the mulch. So it seems to be doing well. The phosphorus does bump right up there, but so does everything else. Next slide. Some of the costs, we can skip this one. That's how my neighbors are cutting this stuff. They it's way more efficient than anything I could do. Next. I tried to do a little bit of a cost. I am getting it for free, but I do feel like this is, if they were costing $50 a ton, that's the amount of money I'd be putting. So an average rate of 1,200 an acre, that's pretty reasonable amount for a fertility rate. If that's all you need to put down for growing crops, you're making, you know, 30,000 bucks an acre on. It's not much even at the high rate there. Next slide. That's it. Some of my sources of inspiration there.
Thank you, Spencer. That was great. And I apologize again for the technical issues earlier. We were just trying to get the PDFs ready for you in the background. So we did just drop a folder of all the slides into the chat, so you can review this information later. There was one question that came up in the chat for Dave and Jeremy from MC, who wanted to know, in April, do you tarp the winter killed oats or incorporate them in any way?
I can answer that. If there's been a lot, if it's just the oats, do nothing. If there happens to be a lot of winter annual weeds that have come through, then we would tarp it. Other than that, there's, yeah, no tillage.
Awesome. Any other questions that have occurred to folks during this presentation? You should feel welcome to raise your hand if you want to ask it live. We have time for maybe 1 or 2 before we wrap up. And feel free to come off of, feel free to turn on your videos if you want to have a convivial atmosphere. I see you, Sorrel and Simon. Hi, nice to see you. Hi, Anna. Eric Nordell asks, any issues with slugs?
We haven't noticed a big slug issue on our farm.
I was gonna cautiously say not so
Yeah,
far.
knocking on wood.
Knock on wood.
It was real dry last year, but the year before we were doing this and it was wet and yeah.
I've had I've seen that, like I've seen them accumulate like frighteningly high on top of Rime, but I haven't had any problems with them eating the crop. So
Interesting. I had a question for the panel, since I don't see any others in the chat. Are there any particularly creative approaches to integrating mulches or cover crops that you have seen on other farms that you've visited? I think Charlotte might have one. This is a little bit of a plant, guys.
You want me to talk about that carrot
Yeah, I really want
situation?
you to share about the carrots.
Yeah, so I talked to Carol about sort of an exploratory trial that one of the farmers I collaborate with did. So she basically wanted to explore potential of direct seeding while using mulches and no-till strategies. And her idea was to broadcast seed carrots on the surface of soil while the rye, so fall rye seeded the previous year. So while the fall rye was flowering, so direct seeding broadcast direct seeding of carrots in a stand of fall rye, and then rolling the rye afterwards. So the carrot seeds germinated very well in the cover. They had good soil contact and humidity because you press the seeds right while you roll the rye. And she also had a good harvest. It's for sure it was broadcast seeded, so it wasn't optimal. Her next step now is trying to broadcast in bands the seeds, like to have rows within her standing rye. But basically it's a strategy that she wants to optimize and maybe use on the farm. Yeah.
I think that's really cool. I think we got some really, really great information today. I just want to thank our presenters so much for taking the time to share about all of your great research and all of your great systems that you're implementing. And thanks to everyone for attending. I did want to note that this webinar was made possible with support from the Massachusetts Department of Agriculture, and we also Agricultural Resources, sorry, and we also put a link to their Climate Smart Agriculture program in the chat, which is a way that you can fund or seek grant support for no-till equipment if you are a Massachusetts farmer. And this project, this webinar is also part of the Massachusetts Coordinated Soil Health Program. You can find out more about AFT's New England Climate and Agriculture program at the link that Emmer will drop in the chat. And also to sign up for, to receive information about events like these, as well as technical assistance and financial assistance opportunities for soil health practices, please sign up for our regional newsletter at the link that Emmer is dropping in the chat. We will post a recording of this webinar on YouTube in the coming weeks. We have dropped a folder of PDFs of the slides that were shared today into the chat. I will put my email in the chat if you have any follow-up questions for me. It is crosell@farmland.org. And feel free to reach out. And thanks everybody for attending, and thank you again to our presenters. A round of applause for their great presentations. Thank you so much, everybody, and I hope you have a great rest of your night.